This is the story of a man who looked to the stars in the 19th century and saw a future in space. He understood it and accepted it as a given. But Robert Goddard didn't just think about rockets. He designed them, built them, and launched them at a time the rest of the world was rooting for Babe Ruth, riding in rumble seats and scoffing at the idea of space. The Germans used his patents to bury London in World War II. 2 decades later, we used them to go to the moon. This is the tale of a moon man from Massachusetts, the Robert Goddard story. When in 1926 he successfully fired the world's first liquid-fueled rocket, he propelled civilization from an era of fireworks into our own era of intercontinental warfare and the exploration of space. In centuries to come, he is the one who will be remembered for putting us on the path to the moon and the stars. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins took man's first trip to the moon. And every one of us alive went along. No other enterprise in history has so stirred the human imagination. All those who could be there for the liftoff were there, including the people of NASA. Each one of them a part of history in the making.
40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting.
Think about this. In the 16th century, Magellan made history by circling the globe by ship in 3 years. And now, in 3 days, America's astronauts would travel to the moon. A distinguished group had worked towards this trip through the centuries.
9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
The vision of reaching the moon has always fired the imagination of our greatest minds. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci discovered that planet Earth revolved around the sun. He designed flying ships which might one day break the boundaries of gravity. Galileo identified Jupiter and Saturn through his telescope and wondered when we'd get there. The Chinese were the first to successfully fire a rocket in 1232 as a weapon of war. In the 17th century, a Frenchman, Joseph Montgolfier, sent a duck, a sheep, and a rooster up in a hot air balloon. He would have sent a man, but he wasn't sure if the atmosphere could support life. The only injury was the rooster's broken wing after having been kicked by the sheep. Britain's Sir William Congreve advanced gunpowder rocketry, whose most celebrated use came in 1814 when American Francis Scott Key witnessed the British attack at Fort McHenry in Baltimore and wrote of the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. By the end of the 19th century, Jules Verne had written From Earth to the Moon, in which he envisioned a giant cannon firing a rocket shell to the moon.
My love was really true.
H.G. Wells then gave us The War of the Worlds. The pages of literature soon filled with imaginative tales of space travel. Pure fantasy, of course.
I fell under the spell of you.
A new chapter began in 1882, at a time when Jesse James had become a legend after having been shot in the back, at a time when Thomas Edison had just turned on America's lights. Science and technology were creating new optimism and turning America's eyes to the future, including the citizens of the great state of Massachusetts, a commonwealth of uncommon challenge and possibility in the late 19th century. In Worcester, the state's second city, people were busily making machine tools, silverware, wallpapers, corsets, and weaving looms. In Worcester, On October 5th, 1882, in a farmhouse built from a Civil War pension, Nahum Goddard and his wife, Fanny Louise, announced the birth of their son, Robert Hutchings Goddard, a child of the 19th century who would lead us into the 21st. As a young man, Bob Goddard was fascinated by War of the Worlds. The opening paragraph captured his imagination and turned it inexorably towards space. Was there anyone out there? H.G. Wells had written, "No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that human affairs were being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's." Years later, Goddard corresponded with Wells, telling him that he, Goddard, could never complete his work. These were Goddard's words.
Aiming at the stars, both literally and figuratively, is a problem to occupy generations, so that no matter how much progress one makes, there is always the thrill of just beginning.
Goddard, encouraged by his parents, had this vision at age 13.
How wonderful it would be to make some device which had even the possibility of ascending to Mars, to be sent up from the meadow at my feet.
Isaac Newton was his inspiration for such a device. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Reading Newton made Goddard realize that if a way to navigate space were to be discovered, it would be the result of a knowledge of physics, mathematics, and a spirit of inquiry. At Worcester Polytechnic Institute, he pursued this thirst for scientific knowledge. He also began keeping his meticulous, well-guarded notebooks, which reflected his sense of optimism.
If there is no law against it, why then, 'twill happen someday.
In 1908, Goddard began his illustrious association with Clark University in Worcester. First as a student, then a notable professor of physics. At age 31, after a debilitating bout with tuberculosis, his patent for a liquid-fueled rocket opened the door to the age of space. Solid-fueled rockets were basically giant fireworks. Goddard's liquid-fueled rocket would provide a smooth, continuous thrust of power, a combustion rather than a jarring explosion. At Clark University, the quiet professor had created the engine with which we could finally reach for the moon and the stars. The year was 1914. At Coe's Pond in Worcester, Goddard completed his experiments with gunpowder rockets, some reaching nearly 500 feet before crashing into the opposite bank. He knew that the jarring explosions needed to power these solid-fueled rockets could never thrust a man into space. At Clark, from 1914 to 1919, he became totally absorbed with the further development of his liquid-fueled engine, and extremely well known for walking down hallways on rainy days with his umbrella wide open, deep in thought. Neither his students or closest associates could comprehend what was going on in the quiet professor's mind. He seemed to be living somewhere off in the future. They were in 1920. We were still wearing straw hats, not space helmets. James Cox and his running mate, young Franklin Roosevelt, were soundly defeated that year by Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge.
The Republican ticket of Harding and Coolidge is running well ahead of Cox and Roosevelt.
Buster Keaton was a comedy favorite on the still silent screen. Douglas Fairbanks made his mark as Zorro in 1920, the year in which women would vote for the first time in a national election. It was also the year in which Robert Goddard's rockets put him right up with Harding and Coolidge on the front page. He had submitted a paper to the Smithsonian Institution asking for a grant of $5,000 to pay for 2 mechanics and an assistant to help him climb his stairway to the stars. They gave him the money, and the media jumped on the story, especially the part where Goddard had written of a future lunar landing as a result of his work. Goddard tried to turn them away from their fixation on a moon rocket.
Every vision is a joke until someone accomplishes it. Once realized, it becomes commonplace.
The rest of the world saw Goddard as a visionary. A German scientist, Hermann Oberth, wrote to Goddard asking for a copy of his Smithsonian paper. Oberth read it and soon published his own paper, The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, based upon Goddard's research. It infuriated Goddard and added to his distrust of outsiders. But life was soon made brighter for the professor by a shy student who had been helping him type up his notes and organize his research. Esther Kisk, bright, amazingly able at discerning his unintelligible scrawl, and a source of unflagging inspiration. They were married on June 21st, 1924. She became his wife, secretary, photographer, seamstress of parachutes, co-stomper out of brush fires, the other half of his life and his work, his constant source of encouragement.
The night was mighty dark, so you could hardly...
In the early 20s, Goddard brought his vision into focus. While Oberth and others theorized about space travel, Goddard was actually building the rockets, making the rules as he went along. The day that will be remembered in future centuries is March 16th, 1926, the day Robert Goddard placed a liquid-fueled rocket inside a pipe frame at his Aunt Effie's farm. In these historic home movies filmed by Esther's wind-up camera, the rocket flies 41 feet in the air and lands 184 feet away. Esther missed the takeoff because the camera had to be rewound every 7 seconds. With true Yankee understatement, Goddard wrote in his journal,
"The first flight with a rocket using liquid propellants was made yesterday at Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn. The day was clear and comparatively quiet."
Robert Goddard had now elevated rocketry from theory to reality. The rockets grew larger and louder, and soon drew unfavorable attention from neighbors. After one shot in the general direction of the moon, a newspaper reporter asked, "How close did you get this time?" In 1927, Charles Lindbergh, a young airmail pilot, made history. The first human to solo the Atlantic Ocean, non-stop from New York to Paris. Most of the world thought it a miracle, but Lindbergh had already decided that the propeller had taken us as high as it could go. As the crowds celebrated his triumph, Lindy had already turned his thoughts to rocketry as a future means of transportation. When a Goddard launch caused a well-publicized fire, Lindbergh read all about it, all about the Moon Man and his dreams. Esther Goddard recalls how Lindy and Bob were brought together by this mishap in Massachusetts.
We were pretty blue about it, but you see, it did have a golden lining. Lindbergh read that. And Lindbergh came up, we sat on this porch and talked, and I remember I had some chocolate cake, and Mr. Lindbergh ate 2 or 3 pieces by the fireplace, and he went back and reported to Harry Guggenheim that he thought there was something here.
Lindbergh convinced philanthropist Guggenheim to fund 4 years of Goddard's work for $100,000. It was a godsend. He would no longer have to teach to support his work, and he could now move to a more suitable location from which to launch his rockets.
We wanted ground with a minimum of people and houses on it, where rockets could rise or crash or even explode without wear and tear on neighbors' nerves.
We did not just guess at a locality. There was a professor of meteorology at Clark, and we looked at the maps. My husband and he studied the maps to find out where an area would be found where outdoor work could be done year-round. And we settled on southeastern New Mexico at a place called Roswell.
This Pueblo-style ranch house, 3 miles north of Roswell and 100 miles from White Sands, where space history would later be made, became the Goddard's new home in 1930. He immediately calmed the locals at the Roswell Rotary Club.
I do not consider that the time has arrived for any attempt to communicate between the planets. The Wright brothers did not try a transatlantic flight first, nor shall I try to reach the planets.
The clean air and splendid isolation of Roswell invigorated Goddard. He even found time to paint a few landscapes. Goddard assembled a loyal crew. One assistant later recalled, "On payday, he would check his notes to see how many hours we'd worked and compute the figures on his slide rule. One week, my pay was $24.78. The next week, for the same number of hours, $26.36. The professor explained that slide rules were not always precise, but that it would all come out even in the end, and it did. Goddard's objectives were clear. In this workshop, he would try to perfect a lightweight, more powerful motor for his rockets. He would also need to refine the problems of steering and recovery, and finally, to devise a miniature pump to feed the enormous amount of fuel consumed by the rocket. It was a task worthy of a large organization. Esther Goddard recalls how Bob struggled with these cerebral challenges.
I realized cerebration was going all the time, even at the dinner table. He could talk to me with the top of his mind, but what had gone wrong in the shop that day was really behind there and waiting to be thought out.
On December 30th, 1930, Goddard conducted his first test in Roswell, a mini Cape Canaveral in the midst of the New Mexico desert. There was no mission control, no board of directors, no bureaucracy, just 4 men and a dream. On this day, their rocket would rise 2,000 feet above the tower and reach a speed of 500 miles per hour. The following September, the professor flew his rocket again, but after rising 200 feet, it crashed. So did many others. It was a time of frustration, but Goddard refused to label it a failure.
It is not a simple matter to differentiate unsuccessful from successful experiments. Most work that is finally successful is the result of a series of unsuccessful tests, in which difficulties are gradually eliminated.
I knew he needed to be very quiet and alone to think about, if you'll pardon the expression, what the hell was wrong that day in the shop. Why it didn't work. And I have one picture where he is looking at a piece of apparatus and scowling, and you can just see the words, "What is the matter? What is the matter?" So this was no small thing, but steady, steady thought, day after day after day. And, of course, trying it out next day in the shop, day after day. This is perhaps what you call genius, but genius must then be just plain capacity for hard work.
It was much easier to get to the moon on the silver screen. Although even Flash Gordon, America's favorite spaceman in the 30s, had his own difficulties.
They missed us with the heat ray. But I think you scored a hit.
Brace yourselves for another charge.
The Germans had no Flash Gordon, but they did have Hermann Oberth. For the popular film Lady in the Moon, Oberth served as technical advisor to the celebrated director Fritz Lang. In the 30s, Oberth also founded a rocket club in Germany which included a 16-year-old kid named Werner von Braun. This society for space travel cheerfully discussed interplanetary trips while Americans were still calling Goddard a crackpot. By 1934, the year in which Hitler became Germany's leader, Goddard had 26 rocket patents to his name, and the Germans made it their business to get copies of every one of them. Goddard now concentrated on inventing a gyroscopic stabilizer. When he tips it, it spins him on his swivel seat. He'd been working on the concept since 1907 when he first wrote of a gyro stabilizer for airplanes in an article published in Scientific American. Now he could steer his rockets by controlling the tail vanes. If the rocket veered off course, the gyroscopic stabilizer would correct it. Here are Esther's camera titles for a 1935 launch in which they achieved the highest altitude to date, 7,500 feet under gyroscopic control. But Bob and Esther now had a suspicion they were being watched. And they were. The Germans had sent a spy to New Mexico to follow Goddard's progress. Was there a weapon here for use in the coming war? Documents later revealed that the spy traveled to the Hotel Martinique in New York, where he prepared a package to ship back to Berlin, noting that Goddard has made a substantial breakthrough in the development of rocket-propelled missiles. The Germans purchased these patents for 35 cents each, directly from the United States Patent Office. Robert Goddard's genius would now receive its greatest impetus from the Third Reich. At a remote town on the Baltic Sea, Peenemünde, the Germans, seeing the military potential of rockets, invested 3 billion marks, 6 years of development, and the services of thousands of scientists and engineers in a new rocket facility. Quite different from Goddard's desert compound in Roswell. The German rocket team was supervised by Albert Speer. They too would have failures, but Speer had as much money as he needed and many assistants to help him solve problems, including a brilliant 27-year-old, Werner von Braun, whose focus on space exploration instead of the Nazi war effort had once landed him in a Gestapo prison. They taught him to put those thoughts aside and set his sights on London. In 1944, with the Soviets advancing on the east and the Americans on the west, Hitler ordered the Peenemünde team to unleash the dreaded V-2 rocket bombs on London. The V-2 was the first rocket to travel faster than the speed of sound. There would be no warning. The explosion would be heard before the missile. The results would be devastating. Rockets had now gone from the stuff of fantasy to a deadly serious business, and the world would never again be the same. Esther Goddard recalls Bob's reaction.
He was not particularly surprised. He just wished that the United States could summon up some interest in it. He had been trying to do it for several years. In fact, in the year 1940, Mr. Harry Guggenheim and my husband went to Washington to a meeting of the heads of Army, Navy, and Air Force, and told them what this would do, what it could do, but there was no interest at all. One day, when the news had been pretty bad, he looked up at me and he said, "You know, Esther, we may be able to get off this planet just in time."
At war's end in Europe, the American Army captured an underground V-2 factory in the Harz Mountains. We also learned that Hitler had ordered the Peenemünde team to create a rocket that could reach New York, Washington, and Philadelphia, a project codenamed America. It could have happened within a year. One of the rockets was shipped to Annapolis, where Dr. Goddard was working for the United States Navy. While he inspected the rocket, his longtime assistant, Henry Sachs, said, "It looks like ours, Dr. Goddard." Goddard replied, "Yes, Mr. Sachs, it seems so." Goddard, now 63 years old, was working for the Navy at Annapolis on a jet-assisted takeoff device. 30 years of fighting tuberculosis had taken its toll. His assistants began to wonder what would happen if the professor could not carry on. Should they start looking for work elsewhere? Rumors grew top-heavy, and Goddard responded.
Called you together to straighten out a few matters that seem to have been bothering you. I know some or all of you are worried about the future. If anything should happen to me, I'm sure there would be openings for you in the Navy Department. And I have recommendations in my files for all of you. To have any of you leave would be like losing a member of the family.
The men stayed on, and their development of a jet-assisted takeoff device proved highly successful. But that one phrase of the professor's lingered on. If anything should happen to me. Goddard soon was too tired to even keep up his diary, so Esther took on another task, maintaining Bob's diary to the very end. On August 9th, 1945, she described how her husband took her hand for the very last time. Robert Goddard died quietly at 9 o'clock that morning. August 14th, 1945, VJ Day, War's End. On this day, Robert Goddard was buried in the family plot in Worcester's Hope Cemetery. President Truman was now warned by Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace that some German space scientists were already at work for the Soviets, that we must move quickly to bring the best of the rest to America. Von Braun and his able associates had decided that their greatest hope for favorable treatment or even survival lay in falling into American hands. But the U.S. was not quite ready to welcome German scientists to our soil. Then, in 1946, the Soviet secret police kidnapped many of von Braun's associates. Joseph Stalin knew the Soviets were 25 years behind the Germans in rocketry. To close the gap, he ordered Deputy Premier Malenkov to round up all German scientists within their military zone. Malenkov responded, which spurred an American response. 457 German scientists were now brought to White Sands, New Mexico, at an average salary of $6 per day. They seemed to know a great deal more about Robert Goddard's work than their new compatriots. One German, on being asked a routine rocket question, blurted out, "Why don't you ask your own Dr. Goddard?"
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The German scientists earned their pay, but in the days before NASA, the Army, Navy, and Air Force each had their own rocket program. There was too much competition from within. Von Braun had the most success, and he was happy to share it with a man he had never met.
It is a great honor for me to take part in this motion picture tribute to my boyhood hero, Dr. Robert Goddard, and to discuss his contributions to science. However belated, the recognition accorded to Dr. Goddard is eminently deserved. Like other scientists working in novel and little understood fields, venturing into unknowns fraught with hazards, he did not live to see the fruits of his successful work. But rocketry in this country and abroad owes a great deal to his vision. And in the light of what has happened since his death, we can only wonder what might have been if America realized earlier the implications of his work.
If you were in the rocket business in the 50s, Huntsville, Alabama was the hot place to be. That's where the Germans were. Von Braun, his team from Peenemünde, and their wives and children. They soon became American citizens, and the neighbors started asking for their favorite German recipes. In the 50s, space truly captured America's imagination, but we were still more interested in science fiction than science fact.
Zoom a little zoom in a rocket ship. Off we go on a trip, heading for the moon at a rocket clip. We're gonna zoom, zoom, rocket. Zoom a little zoom, now we're almost free from the Earth's gravity. Zooming to the moon at terrific speed, because there is no friction. Soon we'll see if the moon is made out of green cheese. Ha, 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 ha. Zoom, we're here at the moon. Let's see what the moon is like. Zoom a little zoom in a rocket ship. Home we go on a trip, coming back to Earth at a rocket clip. We're gonna zoom, zoom, rocket.
In the Soviet Union, there was little time for fun or fantasy, but there had been 10 years of progress.
After the war, we did nothing. We had the experience of the B-2, and yet from 1945 to 1958, this country did nothing, absolutely nothing, to develop rockets. I have been told that there was fierce rivalry among all three services, to the point where one service would say to the others, if I don't have charge, nobody is going to get it. When Sputnik came, that was a real sting, and we could not tolerate further delays.
When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a 23-inch satellite, Americans could not understand how their technology could be so far ahead of ours. We really didn't want to believe it, so most of us didn't. This was an era of outrageous Soviet propaganda in which they claimed to have invented everything from ice cream to baseball. So many Americans dismissed Sputnik as just another Soviet lie. 1 month later, when the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 carrying a dog named Laika, we began to believe. Radio Moscow broadcast to the world, "Our space dog is now flying over Washington, where senators are worried about whether it will bite." Soviet politicians and film animators had a field day. The U.S., instead of launching von Braun's proven Jupiter-class rockets, still held back by military red tape and the conflict amongst the three services, decided to showcase Vanguard as America's answer to the Sputniks. It was a poor response.
Here she goes, plainly shooting out from under the bottom of it. And a huge ball of fire rising up perhaps 100 feet. Apparently we've had some kind of...
After the debacle, the Russians sarcastically offered the U.S. technical aid under a Soviet program of assistance for backward nations.
Dr. von Braun, how would you say we stand in relation to the Russians, and do you think we can ever catch up?
I'm convinced that in the space field, the Russians are ahead of us, particularly in large weightlifting capability, and that at the moment the problem is not so much to catch up, but first build up the working speed that they have already demonstrated. After we are running as fast as they do, there's still a considerable gap to close, and only the future will tell whether we'll manage to close that gap.
Finally, in 1958, the red tape ended. Von Braun and his team were given a green light and successfully launched a Jupiter-C rocket with a 30-pound satellite called Explorer 1, powered by Robert Goddard's liquid-fueled engine. That same year, NASA was established, and from 508 candidates, America's first 7 astronauts were chosen.
I'm Virgil I. Grissom from Mitchell, Indiana.
My name is Walter Schirra, Jr. I originally came from Ordell, New Jersey.
Okay, my full name is Donald K. Slayton, and my hometown is Sparta, Wisconsin.
Alan B. Shepard from East Derry, New Hampshire.
I'm John Glenn. I'm the lonesome Marine on this outfit, and I'm 37. I got on this project because it'd probably be the nearest to heaven I'd ever get, and I wanted to make the most of it.
Malcolm S. Carpenter, Leroy G. Cooper. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
Robert Goddard had envisioned this day 40 years before.
We are going to enter an era comparable in its progress to that in which the airplane advanced. It's just a matter of imagination how far we go. I think it's fair to say you haven't seen anything yet.
The first Mercury hero was a monkey. 11 days after John Kennedy became president in 1961, America sent Ham, a 37-pound chimp, on an 18-minute ride aboard a Mercury Redstone rocket. While NASA celebrated this one small step, the Soviets were about to take a giant leap. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old Soviet major, trained for a mission that would carry us an important step closer to the moon. Gagarin, the son of a carpenter, had lived under the German occupation during World War II, become a factory worker after the war, an amateur pilot, an Air Force pilot, and finally, in 1959, a cosmonaut. On April 12, 1961, he would become the world's first space traveler, the first human to circle the Earth and return safely to our planet. Yuri Gagarin's success was more than a Soviet triumph. It was a human achievement. Gagarin received a hero's welcome as the Soviets trumpeted his return to the world. Pravda boasted that this space feat was evidence of the global superiority of the Soviet Union in all aspects of science and technology. 3 weeks later, on May 5th, 1961, NASA launched Alan Shepard 116 miles above the Earth, the first American in space. Bob Goddard's earliest patents were again essential. So was his vision.
Someday the rocket will be so powerful that probably only the government will be able to build it. When that day comes, the rocket might orbit the Earth like a moon, or leave the Earth altogether and go off into space. I'll never finish it. Others will work on it a long time from now.
There were many honors in the 60s as the race for space became a billion-dollar business, a business that depended on Bob Goddard's genius, but didn't pay for it. NASA's new Space Center bore his name. Esther took pride, but finally had no choice but to file a claim for government infringement on his work. It was settled out of court when NASA announced, Dr. Robert H. Goddard's work as a universally recognized pioneer in rocketry has recently formed the basis of a settlement by the Army, Navy, Air Force, and NASA in the amount of $1 million for rights to use over 200 of Dr. Goddard's patents, which cover basic inventions in the fields of rockets, guided missiles, and space exploration. John F. Kennedy and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, became important players in the race for space, supporting NASA, showing keen interest in the space program. JFK was ready to ask Congress for a huge commitment to space development, as the Germans had done back in the 30s. As the president toured America's space facilities, his sights were clearly set on America putting the first man on the moon. At Huntsville, Dr. von Braun showed JFK the powerful Saturn rocket and said to the president, "This will fulfill your promise to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and by God, we'll do it." The next day, President Kennedy made his now famous speech at Rice University in Houston.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
In 1962, NASA launched the first American into orbit, John Glenn. Glenn had been a high school honor student who lettered in football, basketball, and track, played the trumpet, sang in the church choir, and as a Marine pilot flew 149 combat missions in World War II in Korea. Astronaut John Glenn became an international hero as he circled the Earth in Friendship 7.
All recorders to fast, T-minus 18 seconds and counting engine start. May the Weavers be with you, Thomas. Good Lord, ride all the way. Godspeed, John Glenn. 7.
In 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov performed the world's first spacewalk. 4 months later, America countered with Ed White. When he left his Gemini spacecraft, he became the first American to walk in space.
I think I'm dragging a little bit, so I don't want to fire the gun yet.
(1967), Cape Kennedy in Florida. The massive 3-stage Saturn V moon rocket will stand 6 stories taller than the Statue of Liberty and weigh more than 6 million pounds. A far cry from Bob Goddard's fragile first rocket and its pipe launching frame at Aunt Effie's farm. The Apollo astronauts are in training for the moment the world has been waiting for, since primitive man first looked to the stars. $300,000 workers are pulling together to fulfill President Kennedy's promise, to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. In 1968, the Apollo 8 mission took humans beyond Earth's gravity for the first time.
Called the dry land Earth, and the gathering together of the waters called these seas. And from the crew of Apollo 8...
Their home movies were every bit as interesting as Esther Goddard's, but her spelling was better. Apollo 8 was a Christmas bonus for every American. Apollo 9 and 10 would add icing to the cake. But now the rehearsals were over, and it was time to choose the 3 men who would take us to the moon. Mike Collins, Army brat, born in Rome, Italy, brought up at 6 different military posts. Edwin Buzz Aldrin, skilled pilot, PhD from MIT. And Neil Armstrong, boyish, blonde and blue-eyed from Wapakoneta, Ohio. On the morning of July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center. Neil Armstrong would later recall, it was the first time in history that explorers went to a new land without weapons of any sort. The entire world was able to eavesdrop on a remarkable conversation between these three space explorers and their support team back on planet Earth.
We confirm ignition and the thrusters go. Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for TLI, over. Apollo 11, thank you.
Excitement reverberated through the crowded cockpit of Spaceship Columbia. But the honeymoon would soon be over. As Mike Collins put it, we were about to put our little pink bodies on the line.
That's Big Mike Collins there. Hello there, sports fans. You got a little bit of me, plus Neil's in the center couch, and Buzz is doing the camera work this time.
The next step was to cut the umbilical cord. The lunar module was now to be pulled in by the moon's gravity. It had worked in dress rehearsals, but no one knew for certain if it would work in the moon environment. If it failed, they would perish.
Roger, Eagle, that's right. Roger, how does it look? The Eagle has wings. Roger. Looking good. Roger, Neil, we got if you'll give us crew and data, we got the loads for you. Eagle, Houston, we read you now. You're a go for PDI, over. Roger, understand. Lights on. Okay, all flight controllers, gonna go for landing. Retro. Go. Fido. Go. Guys, go. Control. Go. Telcom. Go. GNC. Go. Ecom. Go. Surgeon. Go. Capcom, we're go for landing. 2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag, 47 degrees. Roger.
There was a final moment of truth when a computer overload, a 1201 alarm, caused sudden concern. The mission might have to be aborted. The decision? Armstrong would bring the Eagle down under manual control.
Same type, we're go, flight. Okay, we're go. We're go, same type, we're go.
As Armstrong and Aldrin headed for that familiar pockmarked surface, Neil remembered there were many others along for the ride. The responsibility for the flight, he said, lies first with history and with the giants of science who preceded this effort.
Forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Okay, I just checked. Getting back up to
This exploration was televised, live, to an estimated 1 billion awestruck Earthlings safely watching back on their planet.
I'm at the foot of the ladder. The limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Yeah, radio loud, clear. How's it going? Roger, the EVA is...
There was joy upon the moon, but there were dangers to face when the astronauts took off in the Eagle to return to their spaceship. If the lunar module's engine failed to function, they would be marooned, 240,000 miles from home.
And you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway.
All went well, and 3 brave men were soon reunited for their 64-hour journey home.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. I've got the morning news here if you're interested, over. Yeah, we sure are. We're ready to copy and comment. Okay, first off, looks like it's going to be impossible to get away from the fact that you guys are dominating all the news back here in Earth. Even Pravda in Russia is headlining the mission and calls Neil the czar of the ship.
This is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, and do all this and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
President Richard Nixon greeted Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins on the USS Hornet. They had been quarantined since their return to Earth because of possible contamination by organisms with unknown effects upon terrestrial life. Shades of Jules Verne. They would now take off with a clean bill of health on a 45-day tour of the world. Three weeks after the moon landing, the Apollo 11 astronauts began their 24-nation victory march. Robert Goddard in his high school commencement address, 1904.
It is often proved true that the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow.
The moon landing, 65 years later, had substantiated Goddard's optimism. There will always be controversy about the cost of space exploration, even as there was about Columbus and his trip to a new world in 1492.
Why do we all want to be up there, up there? What is there to do or see up there, up there? Outer space is the place where we'll trace the future. There's a lot of who knows what away.
Man doesn't live by bread alone. He has to have something spiritual. And if he takes time some night to just look at the firmament and see the wheeling stars and planets there, surely there must be some stirrings that he'd like to know what is there, what is the meaning of this, what is our role in all this.
The dream goes on, a dream that goes back to early man, who first looked to the night sky, saw lights up there, and had the urge to travel to them. In our century, we've opened the door to a new realm. Robert Goddard called it the last great exploration. We've answered a few questions about the nature of the cosmos and raised many more. And most of all, like our ancestors, we still wonder, is there anyone out there? If there is, and we meet them one day, we must tell them about Robert Goddard and his dream.
Moon mad, you say we two are moon mad, when only you were moon mad. My love was really true. You fell under a magic moon spell. My fate was tragic. I fell under the spell of you. You're dancing and romancing and going your frivolous ways. I'm here